In the empire of gold and shadows, there came a night when the paintings were taken down. Some called it heresy, others called it obedience, but all agreed on one thing. Silence fell heavier than it ever had before. Long pause, sound of distant church bells. The year was 726 of the Common Era, and Constantinople glittered like a jewel suspended between two worlds. The great city that Constantine had built 4 centuries earlier now stood as the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, where East met West, where the ancient wisdom of Greece mingled with the mystical traditions of the Orient, and where Christianity had taken root in soil enriched by 1,000 years of imperial ambition. Gentle transition, the sound of footsteps on marble. Walk with me now through the streets of this magnificent city as dawn breaks over the Golden Horn. The morning light catches the domes of Hagia Sophia, that architectural marvel that Justinian had proclaimed would surpass even Solomon's temple. But it is not the building itself that draws our attention this morning. It is what lies within. Sound of heavy doors opening. Step inside, and your breath catches in your throat. The walls are alive with color and light. Golden mosaics stretch from floor to dome, telling the story of salvation in images that seem to breathe with divine life. Here, the Christ Pantocrator gazes down with eyes that see into eternity. There, the Virgin Mary cradles the infant Jesus with a tenderness that transcends human understanding. Saints and martyrs populate every corner, their faces serene with the knowledge of heavenly glory. Long contemplative pause. But these are not merely decorations. These are not simple paintings meant to beautify a sacred space. No, these icons are something far more profound, something that touches the very essence of Byzantine Christianity. They are windows into heaven itself, pathways for prayer, bridges between the mortal realm and the divine. Soft whisper, some kissed the paint as if it breathed. Return to normal narration pace. To understand what was about to unfold in the Byzantine Empire, we must first understand what these icons meant to the people who gazed upon them each day. In a world where most could not read, where books were rare and precious things locked away in monastery libraries, these images served as the Bible written in light and color. They were theology made visible, doctrine translated into the language of the eye and heart. Sound of pilgrims' feet, distant chanting. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to stand before certain icons, believing that proximity to these sacred images could heal the sick, grant forgiveness for sins, or secure protection in times of danger. The icon of the Virgin at the Blacherney Church was said to have saved Constantinople itself from siege. The image of Christ above the Chulka gate of the imperial palace was thought to guard the very heart of the empire. Pause for reflection. In the monasteries scattered throughout the empire, monks spent their lives creating these sacred images. They ground their own pigments from precious stones and minerals, mixing lapis lazuli for the Virgin's robes, gold for divine halos, and countless subtle hues for human flesh that seemed to glow with inner light. Each brushstroke was a prayer, each color choice a theological statement. These were not artists in the modern sense, but servants of the divine, channeling heavenly visions onto wooden panels and plaster walls. Sound of wind through monastery corridors. But in this empire where images held such power, where the boundary between the earthly and heavenly realms seemed gossamer thin, there were those who had begun to question. Was this devotion to images leading people closer to God, or further away? When a mother pressed her lips to an icon of Saint Nicholas while praying for her sick child's recovery, was she communing with the divine, or had she fallen into something that Scripture itself warned against? Ominous undertone beginning. The second commandment echoed through certain minds like a bell tolling in the darkness. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. These words, written by the finger of God himself on tablets of stone, seemed to some like a rebuke to the icon-filled churches of Byzantium. Sound of turning pages, scholarly discussion. In the imperial palace, advisors whispered to the emperor about the purity of Islamic worship, where no images interrupted the believer's direct relationship with Allah. They spoke of military defeats that seemed to suggest divine displeasure, of earthquakes and plagues that might be interpreted as signs of God's anger at the proliferation of images in Christian worship. Growing tension in the narration, and at the center of it all sat a man whose decisions would tear the empire apart for more than a century. Leo III, called the Isaurian for his origins in the mountainous region of Asia Minor, had come to the throne through military prowess and political cunning. He was a practical man, a soldier's emperor who had saved the capital from Arab siege and restored order to an empire that had teetered on the edge of collapse. Pause. Building to climax. But now, in the year 726, as he looked out from his palace windows at the city he ruled, Leo III saw something that troubled him deeply. He saw an empire filled with images, an empire where the line between veneration and worship had become dangerously blurred, an empire that might be courting divine wrath through its very devotion. Sound of imperial decree being written, and so, with the stroke of a pen, the emperor would change everything. The order went out quietly at first, almost gently. Remove the icons from public places. Take down the sacred images that decorated the gates and squares of the capital. Let the worship of God proceed without the mediation of painted wood and golden mosaics. Sound of shocked whispers, growing distress. But Leo had underestimated the depth of devotion that these images inspired. He had not foreseen the anguish that would grip his subjects when they found their beloved icons being taken away. He could not have predicted that this seemingly simple administrative decision would ignite a controversy that would convulse the empire for generations. Sound of protests beginning. The people gathered in the streets as imperial soldiers approached the great icon of Christ that hung above the Chulka Gate. This image, painted on wood and mounted in a place of honor where all who entered the palace would see it, had watched over Constantinople for generations. Now, as the soldiers prepared to remove it, crowds began to form. Building tension, women wept, men shouted, children clung to their mothers' robes as they watched something they had never imagined possible: the systematic removal of the holy images that had been part of their world since birth. To many, this was not simply the taking down of pictures. This was the silencing of heaven itself. Dramatic pause. The emperor feared not statues, but their silence. Contemplative transition. As night fell over Constantinople on that fateful day in 726, the city had changed forever. Where once the face of Christ had gazed down upon the imperial gate, now there was only blank stone. Where once the Virgin Mary had extended her protective hands over the faithful, now there was empty space. The empire had entered a new age, one that would test the very foundations of Byzantine Christianity. Soft conclusion to Part 1. But this was only the beginning. In the monasteries of the empire, in the hearts of the faithful, in the very soul of Byzantium itself, forces were gathering that would not accept this change quietly. The great iconoclast controversy had begun, and before it ended, it would reshape not only the Byzantine Empire, but the entire course of Christian history. Fade to silence. The icons waited in the darkness, and the darkness waited for what was to come. Part 2. The Monastery Resistance, 730 to 740 CE. Sound of wind through mountain passes, distant monastic bells. In the mountains of Bithynia, where the morning mist clings to ancient pines like the breath of sleeping saints, the news traveled slowly, monastery to monastery, monk to monk. The word spread in whispers that seemed to echo through stone corridors like prayers half-remembered from dreams. Long contemplative pause. The icons were gone from Constantinople. The emperor had spoken, and heaven had been made silent. Sound of sandaled feet on stone floors. Brother Methodius set down his brush and stepped back from the icon he had been painting. For 3 months he had worked on this image of St. John Chrysostom, grinding his own pigments from precious stones brought by pilgrims from distant lands. The saint's eyes gazed back at him with an intensity that seemed to transcend the wooden panel on which they were painted. Now, in the light of the emperor's decree, those eyes seemed to ask a question that pierced the young monk's soul. What will you do when they come for me? Pause. Sound of turning pages. The monastery of Staudios in Constantinople had been the first to feel the weight of imperial displeasure. Founded 2 centuries earlier by a Roman consul who had embraced the monastic life, it had become one of the most influential religious centers in the empire. Its library contained thousands of manuscripts, its workshops produced some of the finest icons in Christendom, and its abbot's voice carried weight in the councils of both church and state. Sound of authoritative footsteps. But when the emperor's men arrived at the monastery gates, they found something they had not expected. Abbot Theodore, a man whose ascetic practices had made him gaunt as a desert hermit but whose eyes burned with uncompromising conviction, stood before them like an immovable pillar of faith. Behind him, arranged in perfect formation, stood the brothers of his community. Not one of them moved, not one of them spoke. They simply stood, and in their silence was a defiance more powerful than any army. Soft but firm narration. "You may take our icons," Theodore said, his voice carrying across the courtyard like the toll of a bronze bell. "But you cannot take what they represent. You may silence our paintings, but you cannot silence our hearts. We will not comply." Sound of rustling robes, hurried footsteps. The imperial soldiers had expected resistance, but not this kind of resistance. They had prepared for riots, for violence, for the kind of opposition that could be met with force. Instead, they found themselves facing something far more troubling: the quiet, implacable resistance of men who had already died to the world and therefore had nothing left to lose. Contemplative transition. As word of the monastery's defiance spread throughout the capital, something remarkable began to happen. In houses throughout the city, families gathered around their private icons for what might be the last time. Mothers lifted their children to kiss images of the Virgin Mary. Fathers pressed their foreheads against icons of Christ, whispering prayers for strength in the trials to come. Sound of careful movements, muffled rapping, and then, as darkness fell, the hiding began. Whispered narration. They hid the icons not behind walls, but behind their eyes. Return to normal pace. In a small house near the Forum of Constantine, an elderly widow named Anastasia carefully wrapped her most precious possession in silk cloth. It was an icon of Saint Nicholas, painted by a monk from Mount Sinai decades earlier, its colors still vibrant despite years of veneration. Her hands trembled as she worked, not from age but from the terrible knowledge that she might never see this sacred image again. Sound of digging, muffled by earth. Her grandson, a young man named John who worked as a scribe in the imperial bureaucracy, had already prepared a hiding place beneath the floor of the house. Together, grandmother and grandson lowered the wrapped icon into its earthen tomb, covering it with stones and dirt and a wooden box filled with ordinary household items. To any searcher, it would look like nothing more than a storage space for winter provisions. Pause for reflection. But Anastasia knew better. She was burying more than paint and wood. She was burying a piece of her soul, a window to heaven that had sustained her through the death of her husband, the loss of 2 sons to plague, and countless nights when prayer was the only thing standing between her and despair. Sound of tears falling. Similar scenes played out in homes throughout the empire. In Alexandria, the ancient center of Christian learning, where theologians had once debated the nature of Christ with a passion that shook the earth, monks carefully removed precious icons from their churches and spirited them away to hidden chambers carved into the desert cliffs. In Thessalonica, that great commercial hub where East met West in an endless dance of trade and diplomacy, wealthy merchants used their networks of warehouses and storage facilities to create an underground railroad for endangered religious art. Sound of horses' hooves, urgent travel. But it was in the monasteries that the real resistance took shape. These communities, scattered throughout the empire like pearls on an invisible string, had always operated according to their own rhythms, their own rules, their own understanding of divine will. Now, faced with imperial commands that they could not in good conscience obey, they began to transform themselves into something unprecedented. A network of resistance that spanned continents. Sound of secret meetings, whispered conversations. In the monastery of Marsaba, perched like an eagle's nest in the cliffs outside Jerusalem, the abbot received a letter that had been smuggled from Constantinople. The parchment bore no official seal, no signature that could be traced back to its author, but its message was clear. Preserve what can be preserved, hide what must be hidden, and remember that this too shall pass. Contemplative pause. The letter was signed with nothing more than a small drawing of a fish, that ancient symbol by which the first Christians had identified themselves in times of persecution. The abbot smiled as he read it. The church had survived Nero's fires and Diocletian's swords. It would survive Leo's iconoclasm as well. Sound of copying, quiet scholarly work. In the scriptorium of the monastery, scribes began a project that would continue in secret for decades. They copied not just the texts of the church fathers, but detailed descriptions of the icons that were being destroyed. Every brushstroke, every color, every theological detail was recorded with meticulous care. If the original images could not be preserved, then at least their memory would survive. Sound of quiet instruction. Brother Paul, the monastery's most skilled iconographer, gathered his apprentices around him in a chamber deep beneath the main church. By the light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the ancient walls, he began to teach them techniques that had been passed down from master to student for generations. But now these lessons carried an urgency they had never possessed before. Soft, instructional tone. Remember, he told them, his voice barely above a whisper. The face of the Pantocrator must have eyes that see both divine mercy and divine justice. The Virgin's hands must cradle the Christ child with a tenderness that speaks of both human motherhood and cosmic significance. These are not merely artistic techniques. They are theological truths made visible. Sound of careful note-taking. The young monks wrote down every word, sketched every gesture, memorized every proportion. They understood that they were not simply learning to paint. They were becoming the guardians of a sacred tradition that the emperor sought to erase from the earth. Transition to imperial perspective. Meanwhile, in the palace of Constantinople, Leo III found himself facing a problem he had not anticipated. He had expected some resistance to his iconoclastic policies, but he had assumed that the authority of the imperial office would be sufficient to ensure compliance. Instead, he discovered that he had awakened forces that seemed to multiply like the heads of the mythical Hydra. Sound of frustrated pacing. Every monastery that submitted to his will spawned 2 others that refused. Every icon destroyed in public led to 3 more hidden in private. Every priest who accepted the new policy was answered by 5 who rejected it. The emperor who had thought to purify the church found himself presiding over its fragmentation. Sound of military planning. And so the orders went out to increase the pressure. Soldiers would search not just public buildings but private homes. Monks who refused to comply would face imprisonment or exile. The production of new icons would be declared a crime against the state. Ominous undertone. But Leo had underestimated the resourcefulness of his subjects, particularly the monastic communities that had spent centuries perfecting the arts of survival and discretion. For every new restriction the emperor imposed, the monks developed new methods of resistance. Sound of secret tunnels, hidden passages. In the monastery of St. Sabba's near Jerusalem, workers labored by night to carve hidden chambers into the living rock. These spaces, accessible only through passages concealed behind false walls, would serve as workshops where the ancient arts of iconography could continue uninterrupted. No imperial inspector would ever find them, for they existed in a realm that the secular world could not touch. Sound of careful planning. In Constantinople itself, the Staudios monastery became the center of a network that stretched across the empire. Using the same routes that had carried pilgrims to holy sites for centuries, messengers now carried information about which officials could be trusted, which search patterns the imperial soldiers followed, and where new hiding places might be established. Whispered communication. The monks developed a code that allowed them to communicate safely even under the watchful eyes of government agents. A request for manuscript paper meant that a community needed help hiding icons. An offer to lend books indicated that a monastery was willing to serve as a temporary refuge for endangered artwork. A discussion of copying techniques conveyed information about imperial troop movements. Sound of women's voices, quiet determination. But the resistance was not limited to the monasteries. Throughout the empire, women played a crucial role in preserving the traditions that the emperor sought to destroy. In noble households, aristocratic ladies used their social connections to create networks of protection for endangered icons. In merchant families, wives and daughters used their knowledge of trade routes to move precious artwork from dangerous areas to safe havens. Gentle, reverent tone. Irene, the wife of a wealthy silk merchant in Thessalonica, transformed her home into a way station for monks fleeing imperial persecution. Her house, with its numerous rooms and extensive cellars, could accommodate dozens of refugees at a time. More importantly, her husband's business connections allowed her to provide the fugitives with new identities and safe passage to distant monasteries. Sound of domestic activity, careful preparation. Each evening, as the sun set over the city's harbor, Irene would prepare a simple meal for her guests. But these were no ordinary dinner parties. Around her table sat some of the most learned theologians and skilled artists in the empire, men who had been forced to abandon their life's work rather than compromise their convictions. Contemplative reflection. As they ate, they would discuss not just the immediate practical concerns of their situation, but the deeper theological questions that the iconoclastic controversy had raised. What was the proper relationship between the material and spiritual worlds? Could the divine be represented in human art without falling into idolatry? How should Christians respond when earthly authority conflicted with heavenly truth? Sound of deep conversation, scholarly debate. These discussions, conducted in secret and at considerable personal risk, would eventually contribute to the theological synthesis that would emerge when the controversy finally ended. But for now, they served a more immediate purpose. They kept alive the intellectual tradition that Leo III sought to silence. Building tension. As the years passed and the imperial policies became more severe, the cost of resistance began to mount. Monks disappeared from their monasteries, sometimes reappearing months later in distant prisons, sometimes vanishing forever. Families lost their homes and possessions when imperial searches uncovered hidden icons. The very fabric of Byzantine society began to fray under the strain of a conflict that touched every aspect of religious and cultural life. Somber transition, and yet the resistance continued. In mountain caves and desert hermitages, in hidden chambers beneath great churches, and in the private chapels of loyal nobles, the ancient traditions survived. The icons waited in the darkness, as patient as the saints they depicted, as enduring as the faith that had created them. Final contemplative note. For those who hid them understood a truth that would eventually prove stronger than any imperial decree. That which is loved deeply enough becomes indestructible, not because it cannot be harmed, but because it will always find a way to be reborn. Fade to silence, preparing for the next chapter. The darkness deepened, but the light persisted. And in that persistence lay the seeds of everything that was to come. Part 3. The First Martyrs, 740 to 750 CE. There comes a moment in every great conflict when words give way to action, when quiet resistance transforms into open defiance, and when those who have lived their lives in contemplation must choose between compromise and martyrdom. For the Byzantine Empire, that moment arrived in the year 740, when an elderly monk named Stephen made a decision that would echo through eternity. Stephen the Younger had spent most of his 70 years in the monastery of Mount Auxentios, a rocky peak that rose from the hills southeast of Constantinople like a finger pointing toward heaven. His fellow monks knew him as a man of extraordinary gentleness, whose voice never rose above a whisper and whose hands had never been raised in anger. He painted icons with the delicacy of a man handling newborn children, and when he spoke of the saints, his eyes would fill with tears of joy. But on that autumn morning in 740, when imperial soldiers arrived at his monastery with orders to destroy every sacred image within its walls, Stephen's gentleness transformed into something far more powerful. As the soldiers began their work, smashing centuries-old frescoes with hammers and axes, the old monk stepped forward and spoke words that would be remembered long after the last echo of breaking stone had faded away. "You destroy what your hands can reach," he said, his whisper somehow carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "But you cannot touch what lives in the heart of God." The captain of the soldiers, a young man who had grown up venerating the very images he was now ordered to destroy, paused in his work. Something in the monk's voice reached past his military training, past his fear of imperial displeasure, and touched the core of his being. For a moment that stretched into eternity, soldier and monk faced each other across a divide that separated not just church and state, but two completely different understandings of what it meant to be human. Then the moment passed, duty reasserted itself, and the destruction continued. But Stephen had planted a seed of doubt that would grow in darkness until it bore fruit in ways that no one could have predicted. Word of Stephen's defiance spread throughout the empire with the speed of wildfire. In monasteries from Syria to Sicily, monks who had been wavering in their commitment to resistance found their resolve strengthened by the example of the gentle iconographer who had chosen to stand firm. In the streets of Constantinople, ordinary citizens began to whisper the old monk's name with a reverence usually reserved for the saints themselves. The Emperor Leo III, now in the 14th year of his reign, understood the danger that such a figure represented. A martyr could accomplish in death what a living man could never achieve. The blood of the faithful had always been the seed of the church, and Leo had no intention of providing such fertile soil for his opponents to cultivate. So the emperor chose a different path. Rather than executing Stephen outright, he ordered the monk's exile to the island of Prokonnesos in the Sea of Marmara. There, isolated from his supporters and surrounded by the endless expanse of gray water, the troublesome iconographer could spend his remaining years in harmless obscurity. But Leo had underestimated the power of witness. Even in exile, Stephen continued to paint icons, using whatever materials he could find or create. Fishermen who visited the island began to carry his works back to the mainland, where they were treasured not just as religious art but as tokens of resistance. Pilgrims made the dangerous journey to Prokonnesos, returning with stories of the holy man who continued his sacred work despite imperial persecution. And in the monasteries of the empire, Stephen's example inspired others to follow his path of open defiance. Brother John, a young monk from the monastery of St. Sabba's near Jerusalem, was 25 years old when he decided that he could no longer remain silent while the traditions of his faith were systematically destroyed. Unlike Stephen, John was not a gentle soul given to contemplation and prayer. He had the passionate temperament of a prophet, and when he spoke against the emperor's policies, his words carried the force of divine thunder. He began to preach in the streets of Jerusalem, gathering crowds of pilgrims and local citizens who hung on his every word. The iconoclastic policies, he declared, were not just wrong but blasphemous. The emperor who claimed to speak for God was actually serving the forces of darkness. The destruction of holy images was a sign that the end times were approaching, and faithful Christians must choose which side they would serve. The local authorities, already nervous about the growing unrest throughout the empire, ordered John's arrest. But when the soldiers came for him, they found the young monk surrounded by hundreds of supporters who were prepared to defend him with their lives. For 3 days and nights, the standoff continued, with neither side willing to back down. Finally, John himself broke the impasse. Stepping forward from the protection of his followers, he walked calmly toward the waiting soldiers. "I go willingly," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "because my Lord went willingly to his cross. But remember this day, all of you. Remember what you have seen, and tell your children what happens when earthly power sets itself against heavenly truth." John's trial became a sensation throughout the eastern provinces of the empire. The young monk conducted his own defense with an eloquence that astonished even his opponents. He quoted scripture with the precision of a scholar, cited the church fathers with the authority of a theologian, and spoke of the spiritual significance of icons with the passion of a mystic who had seen heaven itself. But perhaps most powerfully, he refused to recant. When offered clemency in exchange for a simple acknowledgement that the emperor's policies were correct, John responded with words that would be inscribed on his tomb and remembered for centuries to come. "I cannot deny with my lips what my heart knows to be true. Christ is depicted in our icons not because we worship wood and paint, but because he chose to take on human flesh and dwell among us. To reject his image is to reject his incarnation." The sentence was death by burning, carried out in the public square of Jerusalem before a crowd of thousands. As the flames began to rise around him, Witnesses reported that John's face shone with an inner light that seemed to eclipse the fire itself. His last words, spoken clearly enough for all to hear, were a prayer for the forgiveness of those who had condemned him. The execution had been intended as a warning to others who might consider following John's path of resistance. Instead, it became a rallying cry for the faithful throughout the empire. Within weeks, reports began to reach Constantinople of miraculous healings attributed to John's intercession, of visions in which the martyred monk appeared to encourage others in their struggles, of conversions among the very soldiers who had participated in his arrest and execution. The Emperor Leo, now facing a crisis that threatened to tear his empire apart, responded with increasing severity. New laws were enacted making it a capital crime not just to create icons, but to possess them, to venerate them, or even to speak in their defense. Informants were encouraged to report their neighbors' religious activities. Entire monasteries were closed and their inhabitants dispersed or imprisoned. But for every monastery that was closed, 2 more seemed to spring up in hidden locations. For every monk who was arrested, 3 more stepped forward to take his place. The very severity of the persecution seemed to strengthen the resolve of those who opposed it. In the monastery of St. Catherine at Mount Sinai, far from the reach of imperial authority but not beyond the influence of imperial policy, the abbot Longinus made a decision that would preserve treasures for future generations. Working in secret with a small group of trusted monks, he began the construction of a hidden library that would house not just books, but some of the most precious icons in Christendom. The work took place only at night, by the light of carefully shielded lamps. Stone blocks were quarried from remote locations and hauled up the mountainside by donkey and human labor. The chamber was carved directly into the living rock of the mountain, its entrance concealed behind a false wall that appeared to be solid stone, but could be moved by those who knew the secret. When the hidden library was complete, Longinus began the delicate work of selecting which treasures to preserve. Icons that had been painted by the greatest masters of previous centuries, manuscripts that contained the only copies of ancient theological treatises, and relics that had been venerated for generations all found their way into the mountain's protective embrace. But the most precious treasure of all was a 6th century icon of Christ that had been painted, according to tradition, from life by St. Luke himself. Its eyes seemed to follow the viewer with an intensity that spoke of divine presence, and its preservation of the classical traditions of religious art made it invaluable beyond measure. As Longinus sealed the entrance to the hidden chamber, he whispered a prayer that would echo through the centuries. Lord, preserve what we cannot protect, and restore what tyrants have destroyed. Let these treasures sleep safely until the day when they can once again bring light to the world. Meanwhile, in Constantinople itself, the resistance was taking on new forms. Anna Palaiologos, the wife of a wealthy senator, had transformed her elegant mansion near the Hippodrome into a center for what could only be called an underground railroad for endangered religious art. Using her social connections and her husband's political influence, she had created a network that could move precious icons from dangerous locations to safe hiding places throughout the empire. Anna's methods were sophisticated and carefully planned. Icons would be hidden inside shipments of grain bound for distant provinces. Sacred artwork would be concealed within the elaborate wedding gifts exchanged between noble families. Religious paintings would be disguised as secular decorations and hung openly in the homes of sympathetic aristocrats who knew how to hide sacred meaning beneath apparently innocent surfaces. But Anna's most audacious operation involved the rescue of an ancient icon of the Virgin Mary from the Church of the Holy Apostles. This masterpiece, created in the 5th century when Constantinople was still establishing itself as the New Rome, had been marked for destruction by imperial decree. Its theological significance and artistic merit made it irreplaceable, but its location in one of the empire's most important churches made it seemingly impossible to save. Anna's plan required months of preparation and the cooperation of dozens of conspirators. A replica of the icon was commissioned from a skilled artist who worked in secret, creating a copy so perfect that only the most expert examination could reveal the deception. Church officials sympathetic to the iconophile cause were bribed or convinced to look the other way at crucial moments. Even some of the imperial guards were secretly recruited to the cause. On the night of the operation, as Constantinople slept under a moonless sky, Anna and her fellow conspirators moved through the darkened streets like shadows given human form. The ancient icon was carefully removed from its place of honor and replaced with the replica. By dawn, the original was safely hidden in a private chapel far from the capital, while the false version awaited destruction by officials who would never know that they were destroying a worthless copy instead of a priceless treasure. The success of Anna's operation inspired similar efforts throughout the empire. In Thessalonica, a group of wealthy merchants pooled their resources to purchase endangered icons from struggling monasteries, then spirited them away to safety in private collections. In Antioch, the ancient patriarchal seat where Peter himself had first preached, church officials developed an elaborate system for rotating the locations of their most precious artifacts, ensuring that imperial searches would always arrive one step too late. But the most remarkable resistance came from an unexpected source: the women of the imperial court itself. These ladies, many of whom had grown up venerating the very icons that their husbands and fathers were now ordered to destroy, found ways to preserve their faith while maintaining their positions in Byzantine society. The empress consort, Leo's own wife Maria, had secretly converted one of her private chambers into a hidden chapel where she could continue her devotions before carefully concealed icons. Other court ladies followed her example, creating a network of clandestine worship that existed in the very heart of the iconoclastic government. Their activities required extraordinary discretion and courage. Discovery would mean not just personal disgrace but political catastrophe for their families. Yet these women, accustomed to the careful navigation of court politics, proved remarkably adept at maintaining their secret religious practices while publicly supporting their husbands' official policies. As the decade of the 740s drew to a close, it became clear that the iconoclastic controversy had evolved far beyond anything that Emperor Leo III had originally envisioned. What had begun as a simple administrative reform had become a fundamental challenge to the nature of Christian worship, imperial authority, and the relationship between church and state. The martyrdom of Stephen the Younger and John of St. Sabas had created powerful symbols of resistance that inspired countless others to similar acts of courage. The underground networks established by figures like Anna Paleologos and Abbot Longinus had proven that even the most severe persecution could not entirely eliminate the traditions that the emperor sought to destroy. But perhaps most significantly, the decade had demonstrated that the iconoclastic controversy was not simply a disagreement between emperor and monks, or even between church and state. It had become a civil war of the soul, dividing families, communities, and the empire itself into opposing camps that seemed incapable of reconciliation. The stage was set for even greater conflicts to come, as the forces that had been gathering in the shadows prepared to emerge into the light of open warfare. The empire that Constantine had built and Justinian had glorified now stood divided against itself, and only time would tell whether it could survive the trial by fire that was about to consume it. In the hidden chambers and secret chapels where the faithful continued their worship, prayers rose like incense toward a heaven that seemed impossibly distant. The icons waited in their darkness, as patient as the saints they depicted, as enduring as the faith that had created them. And in that waiting lay both the promise of eventual victory and the terrible uncertainty of how much would be lost before that victory could be achieved. Part 4. Imperial Consolidation, 750 to 775 CE. The death of Leo III in 741 might have marked the end of the iconoclastic experiment. But history rarely unfolds with such convenient simplicity. His son Constantine V, who ascended to the throne with the determination of a man born to complete his father's work, would prove to be an even more formidable opponent of religious imagery than his predecessor had ever been. Where Leo had acted from political pragmatism tinged with religious conviction, Constantine approached iconoclasm with the systematic thoroughness of a trained theologian and the ruthless efficiency of a military commander. He had spent his youth studying not just the arts of war and statecraft, but the intricacies of Christian doctrine, preparing himself to defend his father's policies not merely through imperial decree but through reasoned theological argument. Constantine understood what his father had perhaps only intuited, that the controversy over icons touched something fundamental in the Christian soul, something that could not be resolved through compromise or half measures. Either the veneration of religious images was a legitimate expression of Christian faith, or it was a dangerous deviation that threatened the very foundations of true worship. There could be no middle ground. In 754, 19 years after his accession to the throne, Constantine convened what he intended to be the definitive resolution of the iconoclastic controversy. The Council of Hieria, held in a palace overlooking the Bosphorus where Asian and European shores seemed to reach toward each other like hands in prayer, brought together 338 bishops from throughout the Eastern Empire. For 8 months, these learned men debated questions that touched the very essence of Christian belief. Could the divine nature of Christ be depicted in human art without falling into the heresy of circumscribing the infinite? Did the veneration of icons lead inevitably to idolatry, or could it serve as a legitimate aid to devotion? What was the proper relationship between the material and spiritual worlds in Christian worship? The debates were conducted with the intellectual rigor that had made Byzantine theology renowned throughout the Christian world. Ancient texts were consulted, classical authorities quoted, subtle distinctions drawn with the precision of skilled craftsmen working in concepts rather than gold or marble. Yet beneath the scholarly discourse lay the terrible weight of imperial authority, the unspoken understanding that these discussions would determine not just theological truth but the fate of countless souls throughout the empire. When the council finally reached its conclusions, the result was a document that would shape Byzantine Christianity for generations to come. The definition of the Council of Hieria declared that the creation and veneration of religious images was indeed contrary to Christian teaching, that such practices led inevitably to idolatry, and that the true worship of God required the complete abandonment of artistic representations of divine subjects. But the council went further than mere theological condemnation. It declared that those who continued to create, possess, or venerate icons were to be considered enemies of the Christian faith, worthy of the same punishment that had traditionally been reserved for heretics and apostates. The iconophiles, as the supporters of religious imagery came to be known, were no longer simply mistaken believers who required gentle correction. They were dangerous enemies of both church and state. Armed with this theological mandate, Constantine began the systematic implementation of policies that would make his father's iconoclastic measures seem gentle by comparison. Monasteries throughout the empire were subjected to intensive searches, their libraries examined book by book, their workshops inspected for any evidence of forbidden artistic activity. Monks who refused to swear oaths renouncing the veneration of icons were stripped of their religious status and exiled to remote provinces where they could pose no threat to imperial authority. The emperor's agents, trained in the identification of religious art and schooled in the arguments of the Council of Hieria, spread throughout the empire like a plague of theological locusts. They could distinguish between acceptable decorative motifs and forbidden religious imagery with the precision of master craftsmen. They knew which saints were most commonly depicted in clandestine icons, which artistic techniques were favored by iconophile painters, and which theological arguments were most frequently used to justify the continued veneration of religious images. But Constantine's most devastating weapon was not theological argument or administrative efficiency. It was his understanding of human nature, his recognition that even the most devout believers could be broken if sufficient pressure was applied in precisely the right places. The monastery of St. Mamas in Constantinople had been one of the most prominent centers of iconophile resistance since the beginning of the controversy. Its abbot, a man named Stephanos who bore the same name as the martyred monk of Mount Auxentios but possessed a very different temperament, had become something of a folk hero among the faithful for his eloquent defenses of traditional religious practices. When imperial agents arrived at the monastery in 760, they brought with them not just orders for the destruction of icons but something far more terrifying: detailed dossiers on every monk in the community. They knew which brothers had family members in other parts of the empire, which had elderly parents dependent on monastery support, which had entered religious life to escape debts or legal troubles that could easily be revived. The interrogation of Abbot Stephanos lasted for 3 days and nights. He was not tortured in any physical sense. Constantine's agents were far too sophisticated for such crude methods. Instead, they systematically dismantled his emotional and spiritual defenses with the precision of master architects working in reverse. They showed him letters that his aged mother had written from her home in Cappadocia, letters in which she spoke of her pride in her son's religious vocation and her prayers for his safety. They presented evidence that his younger brother, a small farmer struggling to support a family, had been quietly receiving financial assistance from the monastery for years. They produced testimonies from former students who credited the abbot's teachings with transforming their lives and guiding them toward salvation. And then they explained, with chilling matter-of-factness, what would happen to all of these people if the abbot continued his resistance to imperial policy. His mother would lose the small pension that allowed her to live in dignity during her final years. His brother's debts would be called in, forcing the sale of land that had been in the family for generations. His former students would find themselves under investigation for association with a known iconophile, their careers and reputations destroyed by imperial displeasure. On the morning of the fourth day, Abbot Stephanos signed the document that had been placed before him. In carefully scripted Greek, he renounced the veneration of icons, acknowledged the theological correctness of the Council of Hieria, and pledged his absolute loyalty to the emperor's religious policies. His signature, witnessed by 3 bishops and sealed with the official seal of his monastery, was forwarded to the imperial palace as evidence of another victory for the iconoclastic cause. But those who knew Stephanos well could see that something essential had died within him. He continued to perform his duties as abbot, leading prayers and administering the monastery's affairs with his customary efficiency. Yet his sermons, once filled with passionate eloquence, became mechanical recitations of approved theological formulas. His eyes, which had once blazed with inner fire when he spoke of divine mysteries, grew dull and lifeless. Within 2 years, Stephanos was dead. The official cause was listed as a fever that had swept through Constantinople that winter, but those who had witnessed his spiritual collapse understood the true nature of his illness. He had been killed not by sword or flame, but by the systematic destruction of everything that had given his life meaning and purpose. Similar scenes played out in monasteries and private homes throughout the empire. Constantine's agents had perfected techniques of psychological warfare that proved far more effective than the crude persecutions of earlier eras. They understood that martyrdom could create powerful symbols of resistance, but that public renunciation by respected religious figures could destroy the morale of entire communities. The emperor himself took personal satisfaction in these victories. Unlike his father, who had sometimes seemed uncomfortable with the more extreme implications of his policies, Constantine embraced iconoclasm as both political necessity and religious duty. He genuinely believed that he was purifying the church, removing corruptions that had accumulated over centuries of misguided devotion. In his private chapel within the imperial palace, Constantine had created what he considered a model for proper Christian worship. The walls were adorned not with icons of Christ and the saints, but with elaborate geometric patterns and stylized representations of the cross that avoided any suggestion of human or divine figures. The effect was austere but not unbeautiful, a space that directed the mind toward contemplation of abstract spiritual truths rather than emotional connection with personalized religious figures. When visiting dignitaries were brought to see this chapel, Constantine would explain his vision with the enthusiasm of a man convinced that he had discovered fundamental truths about the nature of divine worship. God, he would argue, was spirit and must be worshipped in spirit and truth. The use of material images to represent spiritual realities was not just unnecessary but actively harmful, creating barriers between the believer and the divine rather than facilitating genuine religious experience. Some of his visitors were convinced by these arguments. The emperor of the Franks, who ruled over territories where religious imagery had never achieved the central importance it held in Byzantium, expressed admiration for the theological sophistication of Constantine's approach. Muslim ambassadors, representing a faith that had always forbidden the artistic representation of religious subjects, found common ground with their Christian counterpart on this fundamental issue. But others remained troubled by what they witnessed in the imperial chapel. A visiting bishop from Rome, where the veneration of icons had become deeply embedded in popular religious practice, later wrote that the space felt cold and lifeless, like a tomb for living faith. He could appreciate the intellectual arguments for iconoclasm, but his heart rebelled against the emotional barrenness of worship stripped of visual beauty and artistic inspiration. These different reactions reflected a fundamental division that was beginning to emerge within the Christian world itself. The Eastern churches, influenced by centuries of philosophical speculation about the nature of divine transcendence, were more susceptible to arguments that emphasized the impossibility of representing the infinite through finite means. The Western churches, with their greater emphasis on the incarnational aspects of Christian doctrine, remained more committed to the use of artistic imagery as a legitimate aid to devotion. As Constantine's reign progressed into its third decade, the success of his iconoclastic policies became increasingly apparent. Open resistance to imperial religious policy had largely ceased. Monasteries that had once been centers of iconophile activism now produced documents praising the emperor's wisdom in purifying Christian worship. Churches throughout the empire displayed the geometric patterns and symbolic decorations that had replaced traditional religious imagery. Yet beneath this apparent triumph lay currents of discontent that even Constantine's efficient administration could not entirely suppress. In private homes throughout the empire, families continued to gather around carefully hidden icons for prayers that were never spoken aloud. In remote monasteries, monks who had publicly renounced the veneration of religious images privately continued traditions that stretched back to the earliest days of Christian art. The island of Cyprus, with its history of relative independence from central imperial control, became a particular haven for these clandestine activities. The island's mountainous terrain provided numerous hiding places for endangered religious artwork, while its tradition of seafaring trade offered opportunities to move precious icons to safer locations in Italy or the Holy Land. Brother Marcus, a monk who had fled from Constantinople after refusing to sign a renunciation of iconophile beliefs, established a secret workshop in a cave system near the village of Kyrenia. Working by candlelight and using pigments created from local minerals, he continued to produce icons in the traditional style, creating works that were then smuggled to believers throughout the empire by sympathetic merchants and fishermen. The technical quality of Marcus's work was extraordinary, demonstrating that the artistic traditions of iconography had survived despite decades of systematic persecution. His Christ Pantocrator, painted on a wooden panel salvaged from a destroyed church, captured the divine and human natures of Christ with a subtlety that spoke of centuries of theological and artistic development. His Virgin and Child, created as a private commission for a wealthy family in Antioch, conveyed the tender humanity of the Mother of God, while maintaining the otherworldly dignity that traditional iconography demanded. But perhaps most remarkable was Marcus's icon of Saint Stephen the Protomartyr, painted not from traditional models but from his own memories of witnessing iconoclast persecution. The saint's face bore an expression of serene courage that seemed to speak directly to viewers who were themselves struggling with questions of faith and resistance. The icon became a sort of talisman for the underground iconophile movement, copied and distributed throughout the empire despite the enormous risks involved in its possession. By the time Constantine V died in 775, after 34 years of rule that had fundamentally transformed the religious landscape of the Byzantine Empire, it seemed that iconoclasm had achieved a complete and irreversible victory. The generation that had grown up during his reign knew Christianity primarily as a religion of abstract spiritual truths rather than visual religious imagery. The artistic traditions that had flourished for centuries lay in ruins, their masters dead or silenced, their workshops closed, their masterpieces destroyed or hidden away in locations known only to a dwindling band of faithful guardians. Yet Constantine had made one crucial miscalculation. He had assumed that religious traditions could be eliminated through the systematic application of political and administrative pressure. He had believed that human nature could be reshaped through the careful manipulation of incentives and punishments. He had convinced himself that the deep emotional and spiritual connections that bound believers to their religious imagery could be severed through rational argument and imperial decree. But faith, as Constantine's own successors would discover, possesses a resilience that even the most efficient persecution cannot entirely destroy. In the hidden chambers where icons waited in darkness, in the hearts of believers who had learned to worship in silence, in the memories of children who had once kissed painted wood with the reverence of angels, the traditions that Constantine thought he had eliminated were simply sleeping, gathering strength for a resurrection that would come when the time was right. The empire that Constantine left to his son Leo IV was a very different place from the one he had inherited from his father. It was more unified in its official religious practice, more efficient in its administration, more secure from external threats. But it was also somehow diminished, as if something essential had been drained from its spiritual life, leaving behind a shell of institutional Christianity that lacked the passionate devotion that had once made martyrs of merchants and saints of simple believers. In the years to come, that absence would make itself felt in ways that even Constantine, for all his political acumen and theological sophistication, could never have anticipated. The human heart, it seemed, required more than geometric patterns and abstract truths to sustain genuine religious devotion. And in that requirement lay the seeds of the greatest transformation yet to come in the long and complex history of the iconoclastic controversy. Part 5. The Empress Irene's Revolution, 775 to 787 CE. Sometimes history turns on the most unexpected hinges. A young woman from Athens, beautiful and intelligent but born far from the corridors of imperial power, would become the instrument through which the religious policies of 50 years would be not merely challenged but completely overturned. Her name was Irene, and she would prove that in the Byzantine Empire, where politics and theology intertwined like lovers in an eternal dance, even the most entrenched traditions could be swept away by the vision of a single determined soul. Leo IV, Constantine V's son and heir, had inherited more than just the imperial throne. He had inherited the burden of maintaining religious policies that had grown increasingly unpopular among significant segments of the population. Unlike his father, who had embraced iconoclasm with genuine theological conviction, Leo approached the continuation of these policies with the weary pragmatism of a man who understood that any dramatic change in direction would be seen as an admission that 2 generations of emperors had been fundamentally wrong. But Leo was also a man who understood the importance of political alliances, and when his advisors suggested a marriage that would strengthen ties with the influential families of mainland Greece, he agreed to the arrangement with the resigned acceptance of a ruler who had learned to subordinate personal preference to imperial necessity. The bride chosen for him was Irene, daughter of a prominent Athenian family whose loyalty to the empire was unquestioned, but whose religious views had never been closely examined. If they had been, the course of Byzantine history might have been very different indeed. Irene arrived in Constantinople in 769, a young woman of perhaps 17 years whose dark eyes held depths that even the most experienced courtiers found difficult to fathom. She was beautiful in the classical Greek manner, with features that would not have looked out of place on a marble statue from the age of Pericles. But beneath that serene exterior lay a mind of extraordinary subtlety and a will of iron that would reshape the empire in ways that no one could have predicted. The new empress adapted to court life with remarkable ease, mastering the intricate protocols of Byzantine ceremony and the even more complex networks of personal relationship that governed the real business of imperial administration. She learned to navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics with the skill of a born diplomat, making allies where possible and neutralizing enemies with a combination of charm and calculated intimidation that left even seasoned courtiers impressed by her capabilities. But Irene also brought with her something that had been largely absent from the imperial court for half a century: a deep and genuine devotion to the traditional forms of Christian worship that included the veneration of religious imagery. In her private chambers, carefully hidden from the eyes of imperial agents who continued to monitor even the highest levels of government for signs of iconophile sympathies, she maintained a small collection of icons that had been smuggled from Athens at enormous personal risk. These were not grand artistic masterpieces that would have attracted the attention of collectors or scholars. They were simple, intimate works painted by unknown artists for private devotion. A small icon of the Virgin Mary, her face gentle with maternal compassion, a representation of Christ as the Good Shepherd, his hands extended in blessing toward the viewer. A depiction of Saint Demetrios, patron of Thessalonica, mounted on a white horse and trampling the forces of evil beneath his hooves. But for Irene, these humble images represented something infinitely precious: a connection to the authentic traditions of Christian worship that she believed had been systematically corrupted by decades of iconoclastic policy. When she knelt before them in the pre-dawn darkness of her chambers, she was not simply engaging in personal devotion. She was maintaining a flame that she hoped someday to kindle into a fire that would illuminate the entire empire. The death of Leo IV in 780, after only 5 years of rule, created the opportunity that Irene had been patiently preparing for since her arrival at court. Her son Constantine was only 9 years old, far too young to rule in his own right, which meant that effective power would pass to a regent until he came of age. In the normal course of events, such regency arrangements were temporary expedients, designed to maintain stability until legitimate authority could be restored. But Irene had no intention of being a merely temporary ruler. She understood that the regency period represented a unique opportunity to implement changes that would be impossible once her son assumed direct control of the empire. And the first and most important of these changes involved the systematic reversal of the iconoclastic policies that had defined Byzantine Christianity for 2 generations. The transition began slowly and carefully, with moves so subtle that even the most experienced observers of court politics initially failed to recognize their significance. Key positions in the imperial administration were quietly filled with individuals whose loyalty to Irene was absolute and whose religious views, while never explicitly stated, could be safely assumed to align with her own. The powerful Patriarch of Constantinople, who had been one of the strongest supporters of iconoclastic policy, was encouraged to retire due to advancing age and declining health. More importantly, Irene began to cultivate relationships with elements of Byzantine society that had been marginalized or suppressed during the iconoclastic period. Monks who had spent decades in exile or internal opposition found themselves unexpectedly welcomed at court. Scholars who had preserved knowledge of traditional iconographic techniques were invited to serve as advisors on questions of religious art and theology. Even some of the surviving iconophile families who had maintained their resistance through generations of persecution began to sense that the political winds were shifting in their direction. But Irene's most crucial step was her decision to enter into correspondence with the Pope in Rome. The relationship between the Eastern and Western churches had been severely strained by the iconoclastic controversy, with Rome consistently condemning the Byzantine policies while Constantinople had responded with accusations of theological ignorance and political interference. For decades, the 2 great centers of Christian authority had barely maintained formal diplomatic relations. Now, through carefully worded letters that never explicitly committed her to any particular course of action, Irene began to explore the possibility of theological reconciliation. The Pope, eager to heal the breach that had divided Christendom for so long, responded with enthusiasm that was carefully modulated to avoid triggering a backlash from iconoclastic elements within the Byzantine court. These exchanges, conducted in the diplomatic language that allowed both parties to maintain plausible deniability if circumstances required a change of course, gradually evolved into something approaching a genuine alliance. Rome promised to support any legitimate effort to restore traditional Christian practices in the East, while Irene indicated her willingness to consider theological positions that might bring the churches closer together. By 784, 4 years after becoming regent, Irene felt confident enough to begin moving more openly. The Patriarch of Constantinople, a moderate iconoclast who had been chosen primarily for his political reliability rather than his theological convictions, was gradually persuaded to adopt positions that were considerably more favorable to religious imagery than anything that had been heard from official church sources in decades. The process required extraordinary delicacy. The Patriarch could not simply reverse his previous positions without appearing to be either incompetent or corrupt. Instead, Irene encouraged him to engage in what appeared to be scholarly theological research, studying questions related to the proper interpretation of Scripture and the early church fathers on matters related to religious art. These studies, conducted with the assistance of advisors whose iconophile sympathies were carefully concealed, gradually led the Patriarch to conclusions that differed significantly from the official line that had been maintained since the Council of Hieria. Perhaps, he began to suggest in carefully worded sermons, the question of religious imagery was more complex than had previously been assumed. Perhaps the theological arguments against icons were not as conclusive as earlier generations had believed. Such suggestions, coming from the highest religious authority in the empire, created ripple effects throughout Byzantine society. Priests who had maintained iconoclastic positions primarily out of institutional loyalty began to express doubts about policies they had never personally embraced. Monks who had spent decades in silent opposition felt emboldened to speak more openly about their theological convictions. Even ordinary citizens, who had grown up under iconoclastic rule but retained childhood memories of the religious imagery that had once filled their churches, began to wonder whether change might be possible. Irene carefully monitored these developments, adjusting her own public positions to stay slightly ahead of popular opinion without moving so far that she would trigger organized resistance from committed iconoclasts. She began to speak more frequently about the importance of church unity and the need to heal the divisions that had weakened Christian civilization for so long. She expressed concern about the spiritual welfare of her subjects and her desire to ensure that imperial religious policy truly served the cause of salvation rather than creating unnecessary obstacles to genuine faith. But her most dramatic move came in 786, when she announced her intention to convene an ecumenical council to reconsider the theological questions that had divided the empire for so long. Such councils, gathering the highest religious authorities from throughout the Christian world to address fundamental questions of doctrine and practice, carried enormous weight in determining the official teaching of the Church. The last such gathering had been the Iconoclastic Council of Hieria in 754, which had provided the theological foundation for decades of persecution. Now Irene proposed to subject those conclusions to renewed examination by an assembly that would include not just Eastern bishops but representatives from Rome and other Western churches that had never accepted iconoclastic teaching. The announcement sent shockwaves throughout the empire, electrifying iconophile communities while alarming those who had built their careers on the assumption that Constantine V's religious policies were permanently established. The logistics of organizing such a council were enormously complex. Bishops had to be contacted throughout the Christian world and invited to participate in discussions that might well determine the future direction of Christian worship. Theological documents had to be gathered from libraries and archives that had been closed or restricted for decades. Most challenging of all, the council had to be structured in a way that would allow genuine theological debate while ensuring that the outcome would support Irene's broader political objectives. The empress approached these challenges with the systematic thoroughness that had characterized all of her political maneuvers. Invitations were carefully worded to emphasize the council's role in promoting church unity and resolving theological uncertainties, rather than explicitly overturning previous decisions. The selection of participants was managed to ensure strong representation from iconophile perspectives while avoiding the appearance of having predetermined the outcome. Most importantly, Irene worked to create conditions that would allow the council to reach conclusions that appeared to emerge naturally from theological study rather than political pressure. She commissioned new translations of early church texts that had been used to support iconoclastic positions, revealing through careful scholarship that many of these sources had been misinterpreted or taken out of context. She arranged for the testimony of aged monks who could provide first-hand accounts of traditional religious practices that had existed before the iconoclastic period. The council finally convened in Nicaea in 787, in the same city where Constantine the Great had overseen the first ecumenical council more than 4 centuries earlier. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. This gathering would reclaim the authentic traditions of Christian worship that had been corrupted by decades of theological error and political manipulation. For several months, the assembled bishops engaged in debates that combined genuine scholarly inquiry with carefully orchestrated political theater. Ancient texts were examined with microscopic attention to detail. Theological arguments were constructed with the precision of master craftsmen working in concepts and conclusions. Historical precedents were cited, philosophical principles invoked, and scriptural passages interpreted with the kind of systematic thoroughness that had made Byzantine scholarship renowned throughout the medieval world. But beneath the scholarly discourse lay powerful currents of emotion that had been suppressed for generations. When Bishop Methodios of Sicily rose to speak about the spiritual comfort that religious imagery had provided to simple believers, his voice cracked with emotion as he described widows who had found solace in icons of the Virgin Mary and children who had learned to pray by gazing at painted representations of Christ. When the abbot of Staudio's monastery read letters from monks who had died in exile rather than renounce their religious convictions, the assembled bishops listened in silence, broken only by the sound of quiet weeping. The final decisions of the council represented both a complete vindication of iconophile theology and a remarkable act of political reconciliation. Religious imagery was declared not only acceptable but positively beneficial to Christian worship. The veneration of icons was distinguished from the worship due to God alone, but was recognized as a legitimate expression of Christian devotion that could serve as an aid to prayer and a source of spiritual instruction. At the same time, the council carefully avoided language that would have appeared to condemn previous emperors or their supporters as heretics. The iconoclastic period was characterized as a time of theological confusion rather than deliberate apostasy. and those who had participated in iconoclastic policies were invited to rejoin the mainstream of Christian orthodoxy without punishment or humiliation. When news of the council's decisions reached Constantinople, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Churches that had been stripped of religious imagery for decades were suddenly filled with crowds of believers eager to participate in worship that once again included the visual elements they had missed for so long. Icon painters who had practiced their craft in secret emerged from hiding to begin the enormous task of replacing the artwork that had been destroyed during the iconoclastic period. But perhaps most remarkably, the restoration proceeded with relatively little violence or social disruption. Irene's careful political preparation had created conditions that allowed the transition to occur smoothly, without the kind of revenge-taking that might have been expected after such a dramatic reversal of established policy. Not with war, but with a kiss, the icons returned. The empress who had orchestrated this transformation stood at the pinnacle of her power, having achieved something that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. She had reversed the religious policies of 3 emperors, restored the unity of the Christian Church, and positioned herself as one of the most successful rulers in Byzantine history. Yet Irene understood that her victory, however complete it might appear, remained fragile. The forces that had supported iconoclasm for half a century had not simply vanished overnight. They had been defeated and marginalized, but not eliminated. And in the complex world of Byzantine politics, today's triumph could easily become tomorrow's catastrophe if vigilance was relaxed or political calculations proved incorrect. The stage was set for the next phase of the iconoclastic controversy, a period that would test whether the religious changes that Irene had accomplished could survive the inevitable challenges that lay ahead. Part 6. The Second Nicene Council, 787. In the ancient city of Nicaea, where the olive groves whispered with memories of Constantine's great council for centuries before, the bishops gathered once again to shape the soul of Christianity. The autumn air carried the scent of ripening grapes and burning leaves, but beneath these earthly fragrances lay something more intangible: the weight of theological decisions that would echo through eternity. The Second Council of Nicaea opened on September 24, 787, with ceremonies that deliberately invoked the grandeur and authority of the Church's earliest and most revered gatherings. 350 bishops had traveled from every corner of the Christian world to participate in deliberations that would determine whether the Byzantine Empire would continue down the path of iconoclasm or return to the traditions that had shaped Christian worship for 7 centuries. The great basilica where the council convened had been carefully prepared for its historic role. Ancient texts lined tables along the walls, their parchment pages containing the writings of church fathers whose words would be scrutinized with the intensity of lawyers examining legal precedents. Scribes sat ready to record every word of debate, understanding that their transcriptions would be studied by theologians for generations to come. At the center of the hall, beneath a great wooden cross that bore no figural decoration, stood the seats reserved for the papal legates whose presence symbolized the potential reunification of Eastern and Western Christianity. But perhaps most significantly, in a side chamber carefully guarded by imperial soldiers, lay a collection of icons that had been preserved through decades of persecution. These sacred images, brought from hidden monasteries and private collections throughout the empire, would serve as tangible evidence of the artistic and theological traditions that the council was being asked to evaluate. Their very presence in the hall represented a dramatic reversal of policies that had made such objects illegal for more than half a century. The opening session was presided over by Patriarch Teresios of Constantinople, a man whose appointment by Empress Irene had marked one of the clearest signals of her intention to reverse iconoclastic policies. Teresios was a subtle theologian and skilled diplomat who understood that the success of the council would depend not just on reaching the correct theological conclusions, but on presenting those conclusions in a way that would minimize resistance from iconoclastic elements within the empire. In his opening address, the Patriarch carefully avoided any language that might be interpreted as condemning previous imperial policies or questioning the good faith of those who had supported iconoclasm. Instead, he framed the council's work as an effort to resolve theological uncertainties that had troubled the Church for decades, to clarify questions of doctrine that required the collective wisdom of the Church's highest authorities to answer definitively. "We gather not as judges of our predecessors," Teresios declared, his voice carrying clearly through the packed basilica. But as students of divine truth, seeking to understand more clearly the will of God for his church, let our deliberations be guided not by human ambition or political calculation, but by the Holy Spirit who has promised to lead us into all truth. The theological work of the Council unfolded over several weeks of intensive debate that combined scholarly rigor with passionate spiritual conviction. The fundamental questions that had divided the Church for generations were examined from every conceivable angle, with bishops citing not only Scripture and the writings of the Church Fathers, but also the philosophical traditions of Greece and the mystical insights of the desert hermits who had shaped early Christian spirituality. The iconoclastic position was presented by a small but intellectually formidable group of bishops who had genuinely embraced the theological arguments developed during the previous decades. These men were not political opportunists seeking imperial favor, but sincere believers who had become convinced that the veneration of religious imagery represented a dangerous deviation from authentic Christian worship. Bishop Constantine of Nicolia, perhaps the most eloquent spokesman for the iconoclastic position, argued that the use of artistic representations in worship inevitably led to confusion between the image and the reality it purported to represent. Common believers, he contended, lacked the theological sophistication necessary to distinguish between veneration and worship, between honoring the saint depicted and actually adoring the physical object itself. When a simple woman kisses an icon of the Virgin Mary, Constantine argued, can we be certain that her devotion is directed toward the Mother of God herself, or has it been misdirected toward the wood and paint that compose the physical image? The human heart is weak, and we are called to remove temptations toward idolatry rather than multiply them. This argument carried considerable force, touching on genuine pastoral concerns that had motivated many supporters of iconoclastic policies. The bishops who favored the restoration of religious imagery found themselves obliged to develop sophisticated responses that addressed these concerns while defending the legitimacy of traditional Christian art. The theological breakthrough came through the intervention of John of Damascus, whose writings had been preserved in monasteries throughout the iconoclastic period despite repeated efforts to suppress them. Though John himself had died decades earlier, his theological legacy provided the conceptual framework that would ultimately resolve the controversy in favor of iconophile positions. John's crucial insight involved the distinction between worship in the absolute sense, which was due to God alone, and the various forms of honor and veneration that could legitimately be offered to creatures who participated in divine life. Just as Christians could honor the memory of martyred saints without worshiping them as gods, so they could venerate artistic representations of holy figures without falling into idolatry. More profoundly, John had argued that the iconoclastic position actually undermined the central doctrine of Christian faith, the incarnation of the Word of God. If Christ had truly taken on human flesh and dwelt among us, then it was not only permissible but necessary to depict him in human art. To reject such depictions was, in effect, to deny the reality of the incarnation itself. God became man precisely so that he could be seen, touched, and depicted, declared Bishop Methodios of Sicily, reading from one of John's treatises that had been smuggled out of Damascus during the early years of iconoclastic persecution. When we paint an icon of Christ, we affirm the reality of his human nature. When we venerate such an image, we acknowledge the mystery of divine love that led the Creator to assume the form of his creation. This argument proved devastating to the iconoclastic position because it linked the question of religious imagery directly to the most fundamental doctrines of Christian theology. To maintain their opposition to icons, the iconoclastic bishops would have been forced to embrace theological positions that bordered on the ancient heresies that had been condemned by previous councils. The debate over the theological status of religious imagery was accompanied by equally intense discussions about the proper interpretation of Scripture. Iconoclastic theologians had long relied on the Second Commandment's prohibition against graven images as their primary biblical support, but iconophile scholars had developed sophisticated exegetically arguments that challenged this interpretation. The commandment, they argued, was directed specifically against the worship of false gods through idolatrous images, not against the use of artistic representations in the worship of the true God. The same scriptural tradition that prohibited the golden calf also commanded the creation of artistic representations for the temple, including the cherubim that adorned the Ark of the Covenant and the bronze serpent that Moses had erected in the wilderness. Moreover, the prohibition had been given to a people who had not yet received the revelation of the Incarnation. What had been inappropriate for the Old Covenant became not only permissible but necessary under the New Covenant, when God Himself had chosen to be depicted in human form through the person of Jesus Christ. These exegetically arguments were supplemented by extensive historical research that documented the use of religious imagery in Christian worship from the earliest centuries of the Church's existence. Bishops presented evidence from the Roman catacombs, where Christian artists had painted scenes from Scripture on the walls of underground burial chambers. They cited descriptions of church decorations from writers like Eusebius and Jerome, demonstrating that religious art had been a consistent feature of Christian worship long before the iconoclastic controversy began. Perhaps most powerfully, they presented testimonies from aged monks and priests who could provide first-hand accounts of the spiritual benefits that ordinary believers had derived from their devotion to religious images. These testimonies, delivered with the simple eloquence of men who had spent their lives in pastoral ministry, carried an emotional weight that purely theological arguments could not match. Brother Maximos, a 90-year-old monk from Mount Sinai who had traveled to Nicaea despite his advanced age, spoke with tears streaming down his weathered face about the comfort that pilgrims had found in the ancient icon of Christ that had been preserved in his monastery. "I have seen warriors lay down their swords before that sacred image," he testified. "I have watched mothers find peace for their grief by gazing into the eyes of the painted Virgin. I have witnessed conversions of pagans who were moved to faith by the beauty they saw reflected in our holy icons. How can such fruits be the result of spiritual error?" These personal testimonies were accompanied by accounts of miraculous healings and other supernatural interventions that had been attributed to particular icons during the centuries before iconoclastic policies were implemented. While the bishops approached such claims with appropriate theological caution, they recognized that the consistent pattern of reports from throughout the Christian world suggested that God had indeed chosen to work through religious images in ways that validated their spiritual significance. The council's deliberations were not limited to abstract theological questions. Practical issues of implementation also required careful consideration. If icons were to be restored to Christian worship, what guidelines should govern their creation and use? How could the Church ensure that legitimate veneration did not degenerate into superstitious abuse? What role should religious imagery play in the education of illiterate believers who depended on visual representations to understand the basics of Christian doctrine? These questions led to detailed discussions about artistic techniques, iconographic traditions, and pastoral practices that revealed the extraordinary sophistication of Byzantine theological thinking. The bishops demonstrated familiarity not only with the spiritual dimensions of religious art, but with its technical and aesthetic aspects as well. The final decisions of the council represented a comprehensive vindication of iconophile theology, but they were crafted with careful attention to the legitimate concerns that had motivated iconoclastic opposition. The veneration of icons was declared not only permissible but beneficial to Christian worship, serving as windows to the heavenly realm and aids to prayer and devotion. At the same time, the council drew careful distinctions between different types of religious honor, establishing clear boundaries that would prevent legitimate veneration from degenerating into idolatrous worship. Icons were to be venerated as representations of their holy prototypes, but the ultimate object of devotion must always be the sacred persons depicted rather than the physical materials of which the images were composed. The council also established practical guidelines for the creation and use of religious imagery, drawing on centuries of theological and artistic tradition that had been preserved despite decades of persecution. These guidelines address questions of appropriate subject matter, proper artistic techniques, and suitable contexts for the display and veneration of sacred images. When the final session of the council concluded on October 23, 787, the assembled bishops signed their names to documents that would reshape the religious landscape of the Byzantine Empire. The theological victory was complete, but the practical work of implementation was only beginning. Word of the council's decisions spread throughout the empire with remarkable speed, carried by a network of messengers who had been carefully positioned to ensure rapid communication. In Constantinople, crowds gathered outside the great church of Hagia Sophia to hear the official proclamation of the council's conclusions. When the patriarch announced that icons had been restored to their rightful place in Christian worship, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Churches throughout the capital began the process of restoration even before official permission had been granted. Icon painters who had practiced their craft in secret for decades emerged from hiding to begin the enormous task of replacing the religious imagery that had been destroyed during the iconoclastic period. Families brought out carefully preserved icons that had been hidden for generations, weeping with joy as they hung them once again in places of honor. But the restoration was not merely a matter of replacing destroyed artwork. It represented a fundamental transformation in the spiritual life of the empire, a return to forms of worship and devotion that connected Byzantine Christianity with its earliest roots while opening new possibilities for artistic and theological development. The icon painters who emerged from hiding brought with them techniques and traditions that had been refined during the years of persecution. Working in secret had forced them to develop new methods of creating durable pigments from available materials, to perfect styles that could be executed quickly when necessary, and to encode theological meanings in artistic forms that could escape the notice of casual observers. These innovations, combined with the pent-up demand for religious imagery that had accumulated during the iconoclastic decades, led to an extraordinary flowering of Christian art in the years following the Council. The late 8th and early 9th centuries would see the creation of some of the most magnificent religious artwork in Byzantine history, as artists sought to express the joy and spiritual intensity of a faith that had been liberated from decades of restriction. The success of the Second Council of Nicaea represented the culmination of Empress Irene's remarkable political and religious vision. She had accomplished something that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier: the complete reversal of policies that had defined Byzantine Christianity for more than half a century, achieved through theological persuasion rather than imperial coercion. Yet even as the empire celebrated the restoration of its religious traditions, thoughtful observers understood that the controversy was far from over. The forces that had supported iconoclasm remained powerful, particularly within the military and administrative hierarchies that had been shaped by decades of iconoclastic policy. The theological victory at Nicaea would need to be defended and consolidated through years of careful political management. And in the broader context of Byzantine history, the Council's decisions raised fundamental questions about the relationship between imperial authority and religious truth. If an emperor could be wrong about such basic questions of Christian doctrine, what did this mean for the traditional understanding of imperial power as divinely sanctioned? How should Christians respond when earthly authority conflicted with theological conviction? These questions would continue to resonate through Byzantine society long after the immediate celebration of the Council's decisions had faded. The restoration of icons was complete, but the deeper issues raised by the iconoclastic controversy would continue to shape the empire's development for generations to come. For now, however, the faithful could rejoice in the knowledge that the ancient traditions of their ancestors had been vindicated and restored. The paint had waded through decades of darkness, and now it could shine once again in the light of imperial approval and theological certitude. The icons had returned, and with them came the promise that the deepest traditions of Christian worship could survive even the most determined efforts at suppression and change. Part 7. The Temporary Peace, 787 to 815 CE. There is a quality to peace that comes after great struggle, a particular kind of silence that falls over battlefields when the last sword has been sheathed and the last banner furled. Such was the peace that settled over the Byzantine Empire in the years following the Second Council of Nicaea, a peace that carried within it both the profound relief of resolution and the subtle tension of unfinished business. The restoration of icons proceeded with remarkable speed and enthusiasm throughout the empire. In Constantinople, the great church of Hagia Sophia witnessed scenes that would have been unimaginable just months before. Scaffolding rose against the ancient walls as artists worked to replace the geometric patterns and stylized crosses that had decorated the cathedral during the iconoclastic period. Where abstract designs had once directed the mind toward contemplation of divine transcendence, new mosaics began to appear that depicted Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the communion of saints with a beauty that seemed to make the very stones sing with joy. The work was not simply a matter of restoration, but of resurrection. The artistic traditions that had been driven underground for more than half a century emerged, transformed by their long exile. Icon painters who had spent decades perfecting their craft in secret brought to their public commissions a spiritual intensity and technical mastery that surpassed even the greatest works of the pre-iconoclastic period. Brother Theodore, a monk from the monastery of Staudios who had learned the ancient techniques from aged masters during the years of persecution, found himself overwhelmed with commissions from churches throughout the capital. His workshop, hidden in the monastery's cellars during the dangerous decades, now occupied a place of honor within the main complex. Sunlight streamed through tall windows onto workbenches where precious pigments were ground and mixed according to formulas that had been passed down through generations of faithful craftsmen. Theodore's masterpiece was an icon of Christ Pantocrator destined for the Cathedral of the Holy Apostles. Working with gold leaf that caught and reflected the light like trapped sunshine, with ultramarine blue ground from lapis lazuli that had traveled thousands of miles from the mountains of Afghanistan, with flesh tones that seemed to glow with inner life, he created an image that would be remembered as one of the supreme achievements of Byzantine art. But the significance of Theodore's work extended far beyond its artistic merit. Every brushstroke was a declaration of victory over the forces that had sought to silence the visual language of Christian faith. Every color mixed and applied was a prayer of thanksgiving for the restoration of traditions that had sustained the Church through centuries of triumph and persecution. The icon was not just a painting, but a manifesto written in pigment and gold. The enthusiasm for religious art that swept through the empire created opportunities for cultural exchange that had been impossible during the iconoclastic period. Artists from Italy, where iconoclastic policies had never been implemented, traveled to Constantinople to share techniques and stylistic innovations with their Byzantine counterparts. Monks from Eastern monasteries that had preserved ancient artistic traditions emerged from their isolation to participate in the great work of restoration. This cultural renaissance was not limited to the visual arts. The theological victory at Nicaea had liberated not just painters and mosaic workers, but poets, musicians, and writers who found new freedom to explore religious themes that had been constrained or forbidden during the iconoclastic decades. Hymns that celebrated the beauty of religious imagery were composed and performed in churches throughout the empire. Poetry that explored the spiritual significance of visual beauty flourished in monastery scriptoriums and aristocratic salons alike. The Empress Irene, now at the height of her power and prestige, presided over this cultural flowering with the satisfaction of one who had successfully wagered everything on a single audacious gamble. Her court became a center of artistic patronage that rivaled the greatest periods of Byzantine cultural achievement. Scholars who had spent years in exile found themselves welcomed back to positions of honor and influence. Artists whose work had been driven underground emerged to create masterpieces that would define Byzantine aesthetics for centuries to come. But Irene's position, for all its apparent security, rested on foundations that were more fragile than they appeared. The empress ruled not in her own right but as regent for her son Constantine VI, who was rapidly approaching the age when he would be expected to assume direct control of the empire. The young prince had grown up during the iconoclastic period and had been educated by tutors who, while publicly accepting the restoration of icons, privately harbored reservations about the wisdom of such dramatic religious changes. More troubling still was the attitude of the military, particularly the elite regiments that had been shaped by decades of iconoclastic policy. These professional soldiers, many of whom traced their careers back to the reigns of Leo III and Constantine V, viewed the restoration of religious imagery with skepticism that sometimes bordered on hostility. They remembered the military victories that had been achieved under iconoclastic emperors and wondered whether the empire's current policies might not weaken its capacity for effective defense against external enemies. The tension between court and army was exacerbated by a series of military setbacks that occurred during the later years of Irene's regency. Arab raids along the empire's eastern frontiers achieved successes that would have been impossible during the reign of Constantine V. Bulgarian armies pressed against the empire's northern borders with an aggression that suggested they sensed weakness in the imperial position. Even more humiliatingly, the empire was forced to pay tribute to the Frankish king Charlemagne in exchange for his recognition of Byzantine control over southern Italy. These military failures were seized upon by critics of the new religious policies as evidence that the empire had lost divine favor by abandoning the iconoclastic reforms that had brought victory and prosperity during the 8th century. Whispered conversations in military camps and aristocratic mansions began to suggest that perhaps the theological certainties proclaimed at Nicaea were not as secure as their supporters claimed. The most serious challenge to Irene's position came not from external enemies but from within her own family. As Constantine VI reached his majority and began to assert claims to independent authority, conflicts arose between mother and son that reflected deeper disagreements about the direction of imperial policy. The young emperor had inherited something of his grandfather Constantine V's military temperament and strategic vision, but he lacked the older man's theological sophistication and political subtlety. Constantine VI's coronation as sole emperor in 790 marked the beginning of a period of increasing tension that would ultimately threaten everything that Irene had accomplished. The new emperor was not explicitly hostile to the restoration of icons, but he was influenced by advisors who questioned whether the empire's current religious policies served its practical interests. More importantly, he resented his mother's continued influence over imperial administration and sought to establish his independence through policies that would distinguish his reign from her regency. The conflict between mother and son came to a head in 797, when Constantine VI made a series of political and military decisions that Irene viewed as disastrous for both the empire and her own position. The emperor's divorce and remarriage, which violated church law and created a scandal that weakened imperial prestige, provided his mother with the opportunity she had been seeking to reassert her authority. With the support of the Patriarch of Constantinople and key elements within the imperial administration, Irene orchestrated a palace coup that resulted in the deposition and blinding of her own son. The act was shocking even by the standards of Byzantine court politics, demonstrating the lengths to which the empress was prepared to go to preserve the religious changes she had implemented. Irene's assumption of sole imperial power as Augustus made her the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own right, but it also created new sources of instability that would ultimately prove impossible to manage. The legitimacy of female rule was questionable according to both Roman law and Christian tradition. The manner of her accession, involving the violent overthrow of her own son, alienated potential supporters who might otherwise have accepted her authority. More significantly for the long-term fate of the iconophile cause, Irene's reign demonstrated the degree to which the restoration of religious imagery remained dependent on the personal preferences of individual rulers rather than being grounded in broader social consensus. The theological victory at Nicaea had established the legitimacy of icon veneration, but it had not eliminated the political and cultural forces that had originally given rise to iconoclastic policies. The empress's final years were marked by a series of external crises that recalled the military pressures that had originally led Leo III to question whether traditional religious practices might be hindering the empire's capacity for effective defense. Arab armies achieved stunning victories against Byzantine forces in Asia Minor, capturing territories that had been secure imperial possessions for centuries. The Bulgarians inflicted humiliating defeats on imperial armies and established their independence as a major Balkan power. Most troublingly, the empire's financial resources were strained to the breaking point by the costs of defending against multiple enemies, while maintaining the expensive cultural projects that had characterized Irene's reign. These practical difficulties were compounded by natural disasters that seemed to some observers to carry supernatural significance. A series of harsh winters destroyed crops throughout the empire, creating food shortages that led to popular unrest in major cities. Earthquakes damaged important churches and monasteries, including some that had been recently restored with icons that were now buried beneath collapsed masonry. A solar eclipse that occurred during the celebration of Easter was interpreted by some as a divine warning against the empire's current religious policies. The cumulative effect of these challenges was to create an atmosphere of uncertainty and doubt that undermined confidence in Irene's leadership and, by extension, in the religious changes she had championed. Whispered conversations in Constantinople's markets and taverns began to suggest that perhaps the empire had been more successful when it had followed the iconoclastic policies of Leo III and Constantine V. The military setbacks and natural disasters of Irene's reign were contrasted with the victories and prosperity that had characterized the reigns of the iconoclastic emperors. These doubts were carefully cultivated by a growing network of opponents who had never fully accepted the decisions of the Second Council of Nicaea. Many of these individuals had maintained outward conformity with the restored religious policies while privately preserving their commitment to iconoclastic principles. They included military officers who remembered the glorious campaigns of Constantine V, church officials who had been promoted during the iconoclastic period and resented their subsequent marginalization, and aristocratic families whose political fortunes had been built on support for the policies that Irene had overturned. The leader of this nascent opposition was Leo the Armenian, a military commander whose family had risen to prominence during the iconoclastic period and who had distinguished himself in the empire's recent campaigns against Arab and Bulgarian enemies. Leo was a man of considerable political skill and genuine religious conviction, who believed that the empire's current difficulties stemmed directly from its abandonment of the theological insights that had guided its most successful rulers. Unlike the crude military strongmen who had occasionally seized power through palace coups, Leo possessed both the intellectual sophistication necessary to engage in theological debate and the administrative experience required for effective imperial governance. He had served in various military and civilian positions throughout the empire, gaining first-hand knowledge of the practical challenges facing imperial administration. More importantly, he had cultivated relationships with key figures in both the military and ecclesiastical hierarchies who shared his conviction that the empire needed to return to the religious policies that had served it so well during the 8th century. The opportunity for which Leo and his supporters had been waiting came in 802, when popular discontent with Irene's rule finally reached the point where organized resistance became possible. The immediate cause was the empress's announcement of tax increases needed to fund continued military operations against the empire's enemies, but the deeper source of opposition lay in the accumulated frustrations and doubts that had been building throughout her reign. The coup that brought Leo to power was swift and decisive, accomplished with minimal bloodshed through the defection of key military units and the neutrality of church officials who had grown disillusioned with Irene's leadership. The deposed empress was exiled to the island of Lesbos, where she died within a year, bringing to an end one of the most remarkable careers in Byzantine history. Leo V's accession to the throne marked the beginning of a new phase in the iconoclastic controversy, one that would test whether the theological and cultural changes implemented during Irene's reign had taken deep enough root to survive the determined opposition of rulers who were convinced that they represented theological error and political folly. The new emperor moved cautiously at first, understanding that any premature challenge to the religious settlement established at Nicaea might provoke the kind of resistance that could threaten his own position. But Leo was also a man of deep conviction who believed that his primary responsibility as emperor was to restore the empire to the religious policies that had made it great. The stage was set for a renewal of conflicts that many had hoped had been permanently resolved, conflicts that would once again divide the empire and test the resilience of its most cherished traditions. In the monasteries and churches where icons had been joyfully restored, a new anxiety began to creep into the prayers of the faithful. The peace that had followed the Second Council of Nicaea was proving to be temporary indeed. The darkness was gathering once again, and those who had celebrated the return of their beloved images began to wonder whether they might soon be forced to hide them once more in the secret places where faith goes to survive the storms of political change. The empire stood at another crossroads, and the choices made in the coming years would determine whether the iconoclastic controversy had finally been resolved, or whether it would continue to convulse Byzantine society for generations to come. The icons waited in their places of honor, beautiful and vulnerable, while the forces that would determine their fate marshaled their arguments and prepared for another round in the great struggle between competing visions of Christian truth. Part 8. The second wave begins, 815 to 825 CE. In the pre-dawn darkness of January 15th, 815, Emperor Leo V stood alone in his private chapel, gazing at an icon of Christ that had been restored to its place of honor during the regency of Irene. The image, painted with exquisite skill on a panel of ancient wood, seemed to return his gaze with eyes that held both infinite compassion and terrible judgment. For months, Leo had wrestled with the question that now pressed upon him with the weight of eternity. Was this beautiful object a window to heaven, or was it a dangerous deception that threatened the very soul of the empire? The emperor was not a man given to hasty decisions or emotional gestures. Unlike his iconoclastic predecessors, who had acted from a combination of political calculation and religious conviction, Leo approached the question of religious imagery with the systematic thoroughness of a trained theologian who understood that his choices would echo through history. He had spent years studying the theological arguments on both sides of the controversy, consulting with scholars whose expertise commanded respect even from their opponents, examining historical precedents that might guide his decisions. But Leo was also a practical ruler who understood that theology must serve the needs of empire as well as the demands of truth. The military setbacks and natural disasters that had characterized the final years of Irene's reign had convinced him that the empire was suffering under divine displeasure, that the restoration of icon veneration had somehow disrupted the relationship between heaven and earth that had made Byzantine civilization great. The signs, as Leo read them, were unmistakable. The empire that had expanded its borders and defeated its enemies under iconoclastic rulers now found itself retreating and paying tribute to foreign powers. The natural disasters that had afflicted the empire during the iconophile period were far more severe than anything experienced during the 8th century, when iconoclastic policies had allegedly brought divine favor. Most tellingly, the moral and spiritual condition of the empire seemed to have deteriorated since the restoration of religious imagery, with scandals and corruption becoming more widespread than they had been under previous rulers. These practical considerations were reinforced by Leo's personal religious experience, which had been shaped by the austere spirituality that had characterized his military career. He had learned to pray in the simple chapels of frontier fortresses, where geometric patterns and stylized crosses directed the mind toward contemplation of divine transcendence without the distractions of figural representation. The elaborate, icon-filled churches of the capital seemed to him almost theatrical by comparison, encouraging emotional responses that might be confused with genuine spiritual insight. Leo's decision to renew iconoclastic policies was not made in isolation. Throughout the empire, a network of supporters had been quietly organizing around the conviction that the theological settlement reached at Nicaea had been premature and misguided. These individuals included military officers who remembered the glory days of Constantine V, church officials who had never fully accepted the restoration of religious imagery, and scholars who believed that the iconophile position rested on flawed theological foundations. The most influential of these supporters was John the Grammarian, a brilliant theologian and accomplished rhetorician who would become the intellectual architect of the Second Iconoclastic period. John possessed both the scholarly credentials necessary to engage in serious theological debate and the political skills required to build coalitions within the imperial administration. Unlike the sometimes crude propagandists who had supported earlier iconoclastic policies, John was a sophisticated thinker whose arguments commanded respect even from his opponents. John's approach to iconoclastic theology was more nuanced and intellectually rigorous than anything that had been developed during the 8th century. He acknowledged the sincere religious motives of those who venerated icons while arguing that such practices were ultimately harmful to authentic Christian spirituality. The problem, as John saw it, was not that iconophiles were deliberately engaging in idolatry, but that the use of religious imagery created psychological and spiritual conditions that made genuine worship more difficult rather than easier. The veneration of icons, John argued, encouraged believers to focus on external, material objects rather than on the internal spiritual transformation that constituted the essence of Christian life. The emotional responses triggered by beautiful religious art might feel like genuine religious experience, but they actually represented a substitution of aesthetic appreciation for authentic